If you ever find yourself wandering the old roads of Middleway, formerly Smithfield, West Virginia, pay close attention to the buildings. Some of the oldest structures in town, dating back to the 1700s, bear wooden plaques graced with two strange symbols: a crescent moon and a pair of scissors. The marks are cryptic, odd. Some say they feel menace the first time they see them, and with good reason. These shapes are the enigmatic remnants of a past the town has never fully escaped. Symbols that whisper of events so imposing that for nearly 50 years, locals didn't call their town by its proper name anymore. The new name was a warning, a reminder, and a testament to a story so strange, so chilling, that it defies explanation even today. It is a tale not only of hauntings, but of demons and angels, a story intertwined with death, damnation, and the supernatural. At its core, it is a mystery that lingers just beneath the surface of American history, woven through with something even older and more profound: the clash between the seen and unseen, the divine and the diabolical. The tale begins in the late 1700s when a man named John Smith, no relation to the famous colonist, established a small town in what was then Berkeley County, Virginia. In 1798, the town was officially incorporated as Smithfield, but the name didn't last. It wasn't long before residents and those who had heard the terrifying whispers of the strange events unfolding there began calling it something else. They called it Wizard's Clip. Over time, the name shortened, spoken in increasingly hushed tones. Clip Town. It was a place where unnatural things happened, where clothes and linens were mysteriously sliced apart, where a phantom force prowled the night, and where a single act of defiance, a refusal in the face of death and faith, set into motion a haunting unlike any ever known. Adam Livingston. A hard-working, no-nonsense farmer, Livingston had moved his family from Pennsylvania to Smithfield around 1790. He was a man of practical sensibilities, not one to entertain ghost stories or superstitions. Like most of his neighbors, Livingston was staunchly Lutheran, deeply skeptical of anything outside his faith. But in 1794, something happened that would shake his skepticism to the core. It began on a cold autumn evening when a stranger appeared at his door. The man was of respectable appearance, but clearly unwell. His hands shook as he gripped the doorframe, his face pale, his breath labored. He was dying, and he knew it. "Please, friend," the stranger said, "can you take me in?" Livingston was a Christian man. Like many in those days, he was also hospitable to travelers. There were no inns in these earliest American days, these remotest of places. He ushered the man inside, set a place for him at the evening table, and offered a bed for the night. But as the evening wore away, the stranger grew worse. Sweat slicked his forehead, and his voice trembled with desperation. "I need a priest," he whispered. "I need to confess my sins before I die." The words of the stranger hung in the air like an ill omen. Livingston's face darkened. He was not just a non-Catholic himself. He was openly hostile to the faith. The era in which he lived was filled with such anti-Catholic sentiment, suspicion, hatred. The idea of bringing a priest, a man he saw as superstitious and misguided, into his home? Unthinkable. "No priest will ever cross my threshold," Livingston said, his voice firm. But the dying man pleaded, and Livingston again and again and again refused. Hours later, as the first light of morning appeared over the West Virginia hills, the stranger died alone, without the last rites of his faith, without absolution, without peace. His final breath, his last unspoken words, vanished into the stillness, into the corners of the room. And with that, something shifted. Something unseen. As the stranger fell into the sleep of death, something unseen awoke. On the very night of the stranger's death, the Livingston household changed forever. Jacob Foster, a hired man, had been tasked with keeping vigil over the body before burial. He placed candles near the corpse to light the room, but the flames would not stay lit. Again and again the candles were snuffed out, as if by an unseen hand. Even those that had burned steadily in another room failed to stay alight in the presence of the corpse. A chill ran through Foster. Something was not right. He abandoned his post and fled into the night. This would be only the beginning. The days that followed brought terror to the Livingstons. Adam had buried the stranger's body in a quarter of his field, refusing to defile the town's consecrated cemetery with one of a foreign faith. That first night, hoofbeats thundered around the house in perfect circles, yet no horses were ever found. Heavy footsteps moved through the halls, but no one was there. And then came the destruction. Dishes shattered on their own. Hot embers flew from the hearth, as if hurled by unseen hands. Money vanished from locked drawers. Chickens died mysteriously, some with their heads simply fallen off, as though they had been snapped away by an invisible force. And then it began. One night, as Livingston lay awake, he first heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound. Snip, snip, snip. He'd heard the sound many times before, but he couldn't quite place it. Snip, snip, snip. As he lay in the dark, struggling to remember, the truth suddenly came flooding into his mind. He saw his wife at the kitchen table before the hearth. Laid out before her was a swath of new cotton, dyed a cheerful yellow hue. She was making a dress for their youngest child. He saw the child's shining face smiling as she watched her mother cut the cloth. Snip, snip, snip. The unmistakable metallic sound of shears slicing through fabric. But at that very moment, Livingston made the connection. The incessant snipping ceased. Thinking he must have been dreaming, he fell back at last into slumber. But the next morning, the family made a bewildering discovery. All through the house, blankets, sheets, and clothing had been marked with cuts, and each cut was exactly the same. Each cut as precise as if the fabric had been woven that way. Each cut in the shape of a perfect crescent moon. And it didn't stop there. The snipping continued, happening in real time, in plain sight now. Mrs. Livingston watched helplessly as newly washed bed linens and tablecloths were sliced apart before her eyes. Her husband pulled on a pair of leather Sunday shoes, only to hear the clipping at his feet and to see the moon-shaped bits of leather fall away to the floor. And then the word got around. One afternoon, a neighbor was visiting. He'd lifted a cup of tea from the table, but his hand stopped in midair as he first heard the snipping, then saw the moon-shaped cuts appear in the skirts of an apron Mrs. Livingston was wearing. He ran out of the house, never to return. The curious began to come, wanting to see the clipping and its carnage for themselves. People came from miles away to see the paranormal spectacle of the Livingston farm. Some came to debunk it, some came to challenge whatever force lurked there. A visiting skeptic from a nearby town arrived for coffee, tucking her new silk cap safely into her pocket, hoping to protect it, just in case. When she pulled it out again at her departure, it was ruined, sliced cleanly into the crescent shapes. 3 young men from a neighboring village, eager to prove the whole affair a hoax, arrived with swaggering confidence. They offered to spend the night in the Livingston house, certain that they'd unmask the fraud. They did not expect what happened next. As they sat by the fire, the room fell deathly silent and icy cold. The shadows in the corners of the house seemed to stretch, creeping into the edges of their vision. And then a massive stone, cool, smooth, impossibly heavy, shot out of the fireplace, moving as if thrown by a giant. It didn't just drop to the ground. It spun there. For a full 15 minutes, the stone whirled and twisted across the floor as if held aloft by invisible hands, as if mocking them. When it finally came to rest, the 3 men bolted out the door, not even bothering to gather their belongings. For 3 long months, the eerie phantom clipping continued, a relentless attack on the household. It was not a trick of the mind, nor some fleeting illusion. It happened in plain sight, again and again, not only in front of the family, but to a long stream of visitors that continued to pour onto the farm. Mrs. Livingston, exhausted from weeks of sleepless nights and creeping fear, watched helplessly as her newly washed linens, still damp from the line, tore themselves apart. The sheets, the tablecloths, the very clothes they were wearing, all sliced into strange, deliberate shapes, the same crescent moon pattern, as if marked by some otherworldly signature, some demonic sigil. And then there were the boots. A strong pair of leather riding boots, polished and intact, sat neatly by the hearth. They appeared perfectly ordinary, untouched by the forces that tormented the house. But then Adam tried to pick them up, to put them away. Before his eyes, the boots unraveled, the leather unfurling in one long, spiraling strip, as if peeled by unseen fingers. Hold one moment, destroyed the next. These weren't parlor tricks. They weren't the work of some mischievous neighbor. Something was here, something unseen, and it wasn't leaving anytime soon. The town now trembled, the skeptics all silent, and now someone gave a name to the force, to the phantom shears tormenting the Livingstons. The wizard's clip, he called it, and the name seemed to make the very sun darken, as well as the faces of those around him when he spoke it. As for Adam Livingston, this once devoutly practical man was losing his grip. He had tried everything. Things as a Christian man he had warned against: folk healers, conjurers, spells, charms. But nothing worked. His home was cursed, his family tormented, his livelihood falling apart. And then, one night, Adam Livingston had a dream. In the darkness of sleep, he found himself struggling up a steep, jagged mountain. His limbs burned with exhaustion. The climb seemed endless, unyielding. But then he reached the summit. It was then that he saw him. A figure, draped in flowing black robes, stood motionless, his expression calm yet commanding. And then came a voice, deep, resonant, filled with certainty. "This is the man who can help you," it said. The dream ended abruptly, and Livingston awoke, shaken to his core. Who was this man? It was no one he recognized, and yet he felt certain that the answer lay somewhere in town with someone he knew. The next day, Livingston began to question his neighbors, asking if anyone knew of a minister who wore robes like the ones he had seen, for he was certain this must be a holy man of God. An Episcopal priest in nearby Winchester was recommended, but upon meeting him, Livingston felt nothing. This was not the man he had seen. He searched further, asking anyone who would listen. And then someone suggested the McSherry family. The McSherrys were Catholics, Irish farmers Livingston kept his distance from. The man was desperate for help. When Mr. McSherry opened his door, he found Adam Livingston there, with his hat and heart in his hands. Livingston sat at his neighbor's table and poured out his story. It was a story they'd heard from hushed voices in town, taking little note of it, thinking it some kind of prank. But now, as this broken man shared it, their hearts softened and they believed. When Livingston described his dream and the man he was searching for, the McSherrys exchanged knowing glances. They did know a man, they said, a circuit rider who came to Shepherdstown on occasion to say Mass. As luck would have it, he would be doing so the following Sunday. Early that Sunday morning, Livingston left his house as the sun rose, saying nothing to his wife about where he was going, only that they would not be attending services that day. He arrived in Shepherdstown at the home of a Catholic family hosting the visiting priest. A dozen horses were tethered outside, and some wagons that had brought families to worship and receive the sacraments. Livingston's hatred for the Catholic faith reared in his heart, but he made his way up the stone path to the door, his heart pounding. Inside, he took a chair among the others, waiting for the Mass to begin. A few minutes later, the kitchen door opened, and the priest stepped forward, his deep, black robes catching the soft glow of the candles. Livingston felt the air leave his lungs. It was him, the man from his dream. After the Mass, and after the faithful had departed, Livingston approached the priest. His name, he found, was Father Dennis Cahill, a Jesuit, draped in the famous black robes of his order. Livingston poured out his story, his voice shaking, his eyes brimming with desperation. The priest, at first, was skeptical. He suspected trickery, imagination, hysteria. Then, Livingston, sensing defeat, broke. He fell to his knees and began to cry. Something in Father Cahill shifted. He agreed to visit the home. When Father Cahill entered the house, he was immediately struck by the unnatural energy that clung to the air. He moved through the house, sprinkling holy water, invoking the house blessings and prayers of the church. Moments later, something astonishing happened. The money that had vanished, the coins and bills that had been stolen by unseen hands, reappeared on the doorstep. The priest departed and wished the family well, but the hauntings were not over. As soon as the priest had left, Adam fetched a sack of potatoes from the cellar. On the way up the stairs to the kitchen, he heard the unmistakable, damnable sound again. Snip, 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 snip. The sack in his hands had been cut to shreds, the rows of moons seeming to laugh at him. The heavy potatoes tore through the scant fabric that remained and tumbled down the steps. It was weeks before Father Cahill returned to Shepherdstown. When he did, Livingston was there to greet him. He told the priest of the terrors the family had suffered since his first visit. Not long after, the priest returned to the Livingston farm, this time with another priest in tow. Father Demetrius Gallatin had heard the tale of the wizard clip at his home in a nearby town. He had come to say Mass in the Livingston home. By now, any anti-Catholic sentiment the Livingstons had harbored had melted away. The priests were welcomed with open arms. As the family stood silent in the corners of the room, the rosy afternoon sun curled into the scene through the small windows. Mrs. Livingston had laid out her finest linen tablecloth, trying as best she could to hide the moon-shaped cuts that had been made along the edge. Their neighbor, Mr. McSherry, served as sacristan, setting on the cloth a silver cup and plate that Father Gallatin took from a leather satchel. A pure white linen napkin was set next to these, and then, from a suede case, the priest withdrew a shining crucifix and laid it on the table. A cup of wine was poured, and a crust of bread laid on the plate by Mrs. Livingston. And then the Mass began. When the priest departed, for the first time in years, there was peace on the Livingston farm. Deeply changed by the experience, Adam Livingston and his family converted to Catholicism. The man became known for his devotion to the faith, and in a final act, he donated a portion of his land to the church. That land, where the stranger had been buried, became known as Priest Field. And today, it remains a Catholic retreat center, a sanctified space where the echoes of the past still linger. But if you were to think that's where the story ends, why, you'd be mistaken. Because though the destruction of the wizard's clip ceased, something else took its place. It started not long after the family's conversion. The entire Livingston family was gathered in a room when they suddenly became aware that they were not alone. There, standing among them, was a man no one had seen enter. He was dressed in rags, barefoot despite the bitter chill outside, and yet he seemed perfectly at ease. He was, to all appearances, a beggar, though there was something not quite right about him. Mr. Livingston, ever the practical man, offered the stranger shoes and a coat, but the man said something that sent a shiver through the room. "They are not needed where I am from." He remained with the family for a while, speaking with them, teaching them things that no ordinary man could have known. He spoke of salvation and damnation as though he knew personally of them, of the soul's journey after death, and of sins that ripple through generations. And then he made a chilling proclamation. "Luther and Calvin are in hell," he said plainly, "and each soul that is lost through their fault adds to their torment." Then, just as strangely as he had appeared, the man left the house, stepped through the front door, and vanished. The family rushed outside, but there was no trace of him, no footprints in the dirt, no sign that anyone had ever walked that way at all, just an empty road stretching into the darkness. This strange presence, this unknown entity, would only make that single visit, Afterwards, the Livingstons saw no one. There was only the voice. The voice spoke to them constantly, urging them, pleading with them, and it had but one admonition: they must pray for the dead. The voice warned that souls in purgatory suffered greatly and needed the prayers of the living to be released into heaven. On his first visit, the strange visitor had told them about this place, a place Catholics believed in. It was a place where good sinners go after death, he told them. Those not destined for hell, but not purified enough for heaven. And there they waited, he told them, until the prayers and masses of the living burned their impurities away and freed them to paradise. Though the Livingstons had converted, some of their old beliefs held fast. The God they'd always known takes the good dead straight to heaven, they believed. Though they tried to have faith in the Catholic dogma, they struggled to do so. And then one day, while working in the fields, Adam Livingston heard something so chilling, so unnatural, that his body collapsed under the weight of it. His sons found him hunched over, unable to move, his face ashen. "A scream," he gasped. "I heard a soul scream from purgatory." The boys had to carry him home. He later said he could never forget that sound, the agonized cry of a soul trapped between worlds, pleading for help. After that day, the family began to pray for the souls of the dead, and the voice continued to teach them. Years later, a witness would share a strange tale of the evening he stayed in the Livingston house. In the dead of night, the house was startled awake by the voice speaking aloud. The words were not for him alone. They were meant for everyone. "Wake up," it commanded. "Pray for poor sinners." Startled, the household gathered. The visitor joined them, and they followed the voice's command. As the weeks, months, and years rolled on, over and over, the voice instructed the family and its guests in the depths of Catholic teaching, insisting on the power of the sacraments, the necessity of repentance, and the eternal fate of the soul. Always, always urging prayers for the dead. More than once, the voice predicted deaths before they happened, always instructing the family to warn those near death to confess their sins. And the voice instructed the family to have masses said for the departed so they would not be lost. One morning, Livingston arrived at the McSherry home, looking grim. "Your sister, Mary Spalding, died last night," he told his neighbor. The McSherrys were stunned. No word had reached them of such news. "The voice told me," Livingston explained. "It said she was in purgatory because of her overindulgence of her children." Not long after, a letter arrived confirming the truth. Mary Spalding had died that very night. Mrs. McSherry arranged for 80 masses to be said for her soul. And then there was the case of a certain priest, a man of great holiness, long dead. Curious about his fate, Mrs. McSherry, who fondly remembered him, asked Livingston to inquire of the voice what had become of him. "Surely he is in heaven," she said. But the voice gave an answer she did not expect. "No, he is still in purgatory. He was careless in handling the property of orphans, trusting others to manage it without ensuring it was done properly." 17 years, Mrs. McSherry remembered, and still not free. The souls in purgatory spoken of by the voice were not only something to be taken on faith. They left physical evidence behind. One night, the family awoke to a blood-curdling scream. Not human, not earthly. Then, a desperate cry filled the house, a cry for help. The Livingstons, their guests, Everyone heard it. "What help do you need?" they asked into the air. "Prayers," the voice wailed. And then, to prove it was there, the voice demanded an object be held up. A nightgown was lifted into the air, and before their eyes, a burning handprint appeared on the fabric, the fingers leaving scorched marks, the spaces between them untouched. The smell of charred fabric filled the room. On another occasion, a similar cry for help was heard, and this time a shirt belonging to Mr. Livingston was offered up. A cross burned itself into the cloth, an unmistakable sign of suffering. This time, the spirit identified itself. "My name is Catherine Goodman," it said. "I was your kin, but I am not yet free." Several of these burnt garments were preserved for years, eventually taken to the church at a nearby seminary. Witnesses who saw them reported the same thing: the handprints, the scorched crosses, the undeniable evidence of something beyond human understanding. The voice also gave insight into strange events of the past. Years before, Mrs. McSherry had seen her infant son's cradle rock violently on its own, as though something unseen, something malevolent, was about to hurl the child against the wall. Those many years later, the voice would recall the incident. The devil tried to destroy the child because he knew one day the child would be his enemy. And in fact, that baby would grow up to be Father William McSherry, a Jesuit priest. The voice also made predictions about the future. "War, pestilence, famine," the voice prophesied. "You will not live to see it, but your children will." And true to its word, war came. The Civil War would ravage the land. But among the Sherry descendants who fought, 7 out of 8 survived. The voice had promised that those who remained faithful would be spared. Today, all that remains of the town once called Wizard's Clip are the plaques on the buildings. The strange markings of the moon and scissors, icons of the inexplicable and impossible. The Livingston farmhouse is long gone, and the home of the McSherrys, where the devil once rocked the family cradle of a future priest. Despite all that had happened, most of the Livingston children would lose their faith, the faith that had come through such harrowing and extraordinary events. In Priest Field, a small monument stands to Adam Livingston in thanksgiving for his donation of the land to the church. And inside the All Souls Chapel of the retreat center there, the altar displays an image of Demetrius Galitzin, the exorcist who ended the reign of terror on the Livingston farm, and whose visit opened the door to the Catholic faith and to the voice. Behind him, if you look closely, you'll see a piece of fabric depicted. And if you look closer still, you'll see there are cuts in the fabric in the shape of crescent moons.